Hello, and welcome back to the Crime Reel. For today's true crime narration, we shall be looking at the life of David Burke. David Augustus Burke was born on the 18th of May 1952 in the United Kingdom. He was the second of 4 sons born to Iris and Altamont Burke. The family emigrated from the UK to the US, where they settled in Rochester, New York. When the youngest of the 4 boys died from a heroin overdose, it devastated the entire family. David never married, but had 7 children by 4 different women. Information about David's character and personality vary greatly, with some describing him as being incredibly mercenary with an extremely violent temper, whilst others state that he was a friendly and helpful man who was well liked. When he was in his early 20s, David began working at US Air in New York. He worked there for around 14 years, and during this time was being investigated for being involved in smuggling cocaine into the US from Jamaica. However, no charges were ever brought against him for this. There was also many allegations that he was involved in a stolen car ring. This again was unproven. Because of this, David had become well known to local law enforcement. In 1986, David moved from New York to Los Angeles. This was rumoured to be so that he could escape the cloud of suspicion which hung over him, and also to be closer to his girlfriend, Jacqueline Camacho. Still working for US Air, who in May 1987 had completed the purchase of Pacific Southwest Airlines, David was now a ticketing agent working at Los Angeles International Airport. He lived in a modest condo in West Spring Street in Long Beach, California. By late 1987, Jacqueline had taken out a restraining order against David as his behaviour towards her had become increasingly violent. On 19th of November 1987, David was fired from his job with US Air. A hidden camera had recorded him stealing $69 from the airline cocktail fund. This is the equivalent of around $150 today. After David was fired, he scheduled a meeting with his manager, Ray Thompson, in December 1987. Ray was a 48-year-old supervisor at US Air who was married to Dorothy, a flight attendant with American Airlines. Ray lived near San Francisco and would fly between San Francisco and Los Angeles on his daily commute. When David arrived for the meeting at around 12:30 p.m. on Monday the 7th of December 1987, he was determined to get his job back. However, Ray, who was described as being a firm but fair supervisor, was not prepared to change his mind. David had been caught stealing, and therefore there was no alternative. He had to be fired. David was not happy with the outcome of the meeting, and once it was over, purchased a one-way flight ticket for the Pacific Southwest Airline, flight number 1771, from Los Angeles to San Francisco. The flight, which lasted around 1 hour 12 minutes, was scheduled to leave Los Angeles at 3:30 p.m. that afternoon. Still using his employee credentials, David boarded the flight and waited for takeoff. Also on board the plane was his former boss, Ray Thompson. The flight ascended to around 22,000 feet, and David left his seat, making his way along the aisle towards Ray. As David walked past Ray, he dropped a note into his lap which he had written on an air sickness bag. The note read, "Hi Ray, I think it's sort of ironical that we end up like this. I asked for some leniency for my family, remember? Well, I got none, and you'll get none." David then continued down the aisle and went into the aircraft toilet. In the privacy of the cubicle, David got out the Smith & Wesson revolver which he had brought with him onto the plane. As David had boarded using his employee credentials, he was able to bypass the usual passenger security and simply boarded the plane with a gun. David walked out of the toilet and headed back down the aisle towards where Ray was sitting. As he approached Ray, David shot him twice at close range. Realising what was happening, A flight attendant by the name of Deborah Neal ran into the cockpit shouting to the pilot, Captain Greg Lindemood, and First Officer James Nunn, that they had a problem. When the captain questioned what the problem was, David shot Deborah and calmly stated, "I am the problem." David then turned the gun on the captain and first officer, shooting them both. With the flight crew incapacitated, the plane started to nosedive towards the ground, possibly due to either the captain or first officer being slumped over the control column, or perhaps due to David deliberately pointing the plane downwards. Another passenger on board the flight was the Los Angeles chief pilot for Pacific Southwest Airlines, 41-year-old Douglas Arthur. Douglas rose from his seat and tried to get to the cockpit to save the aircraft. David used his final bullet to shoot Douglas. At 4:14 p.m, the plane, by now in an almost vertical descent and travelling at over 700 miles per hour, crashed into the hillside of a cattle ranch in the Santa Lucia Mountains, approximately 175 miles northwest of Los Angeles. It took just 47 seconds from the moment the first shot was fired until the time of impact. All 43 people on board lost their lives. The first detective at the scene initially thought that the crashed plane must have been a small aircraft, possibly carrying something like paper. The debris was spread out over an extremely large area, and the wreckage no longer had any shape which could easily be recognised as part of a plane. Both the National Transportation Safety Board and the FBI were brought in to investigate the crash. 2 days into the search, on December the 9th, 1987, they found part of a gun. It contained 6 spent cartridges, and in the trigger they found a fragment of a finger, which was subsequently matched as belonging to David. This led to investigators believing that he was alive and holding the gun up until the moment of impact, disproving some theories that he had taken his own life. The plane's black box was discovered, which gave crucial details, enabling investigators to work out the timeline of the events on the plane. Further evidence was discovered, including the note written on the air sickness bag. This was identified as being in David's handwriting, as well as David's airline credentials were also found. As the investigation continued, it was found that the gun used in the attack had belonged to one of David's co-workers, who confirmed that he had lent the gun to David a few days before the crash. In addition, it was discovered that David had left a goodbye message on Jacqueline's answering machine, as well as changing his life insurance and will in the week prior to his death. Whilst David's family did not believe he was capable of such an atrocity, all of the evidence pointed to David being responsible, and had he survived the crash, he would have been charged with air piracy and murder. With no survivors to tell exactly what had happened on board the flight, and evidence being scattered and at times destroyed due to the force of the crash, the exact sequence of events can never be fully determined, but there seems to be general agreement that the events unfolded as stated. On board the flight, amongst others, was 53-year-old James Seiler, the president of Chevron USA, together with 3 of the company's executives, 60-year-old Owen Murphy, 56-year-old Jocelyn Kemp, and 45-year-old Alan Swanson. Additionally, there were 3 top officials from Pacific Bell. As a result of their deaths, many large corporations created policies which stopped multiple executives travelling on the same flights together. In the aftermath of this disaster, federal laws were passed which required immediate seizure of employee credentials after an employee's termination from an airline or airport position. 42 innocent people needlessly lost their lives that day, stemming from a disciplinary hearing over $69. Today's story was recommended by 3 people: Gustav Babbage, Lemon Sky, and Liberty's Incursion. If anyone else recommended it, sorry I didn't make a note. In the Garden of Hope section of the Los Osos Valley Memorial Park, there is a granite and bronze marker honouring the passengers and crew of Pacific Southwest Airlines Flight 1771. A number of the 43 crash victims were buried in that particular cemetery. It reads, "In memory of those who lost their lives in the air tragedy of December the 7th, 1987, San Luis Obispo County, California. Please add any comments down below. And now it's time for Petty Crime. From Queensland in Australia, Mel has kindly sent in pictures of Rafferty, who is also known as Riff Raff. Riff Raff is their 9-month-old shelter rescue, Louisiana Catahoula leopard pup. Some of us can relate to this. On his first ever day being left home alone for 2 hours, he destroyed 2 rooms, gathered up his toys, and crept into the master bedroom and fell fast asleep. Thanks for the pictures, Mel. Next up we have Tink the cat and Pep the pup. These are kindly been sent in by Cy B. Cy B is worried she may be overthinking it, but thinks Tink's sweet face is unsettling. Cy B is also a fan of my tongs, so just for you, here's a picture. Thanks for the picture, Cy. As ever, thanks very much for listening to The Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. Psst. Last Friday, I went to the dentist for emergency treatment. I had a wisdom tooth removed. That's 3 bits of wisdom gone now, just 1 left. Goodbye.